In a rough old town where folks buy people like they're shopping for horses, a mysterious stranger picks the one woman nobody wants, the fierce one in chains. But he's not there to buy a wife. He's there for payback, and she's got secrets that could blow everything wide open. The man in the dusty coat walked past 12 women and stopped at the 13th. She was the only one wearing iron restraints around her wrists. She was the only one they said no decent man would ever choose. And she was the only one whose eyes didn't drop when he looked at her. "That one?" Sterling Maddox said, pointing directly at the young Comanche woman. The crowd went silent. Someone dropped a bottle. The merchant who ran this place, this terrible place where men came to buy companions, stared at Sterling like he just announced he wanted to marry a rattlesnake. "Sir, I think you misunderstood," Cyrus Monroe said carefully. "The others are much more suitable. This one here, she's not broken in properly, still fights, still bites." Sterling pulled out a worn leather pouch and counted out more silver coins than most men in this settlement had seen in months. But something was wrong with this picture. The coins were too clean, too new, and when he set them down, his hand moved with the precision of someone who'd done this before many times. "I said that one," Sterling repeated, never taking his eyes off the girl. What Monroe didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Sterling Maddox hadn't come here to buy a bride. He'd come for something else entirely. And the young woman in shackles, she wasn't just any captive, she was the reason he was here. The woman in shackles didn't flinch when every eye in the settlement turned toward her. Ayanna had learned long ago that showing fear only made things worse. But when the stranger in the dusty coat pointed at her, something flickered across her. Dark eyes. Not fear. Recognition. Monroe's face twisted into what might have been a smile if it hadn't looked so much like a grimace. "Sir, you don't understand what you're asking for. This one killed 2 of my men when we brought her in. She hasn't spoken a word of English since we caught her, and she's never been domesticated." Sterling stepped closer to the wooden platform where the women stood in a ragged line. The other men in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't how these transactions usually went. Most buyers spent time examining their choices, asking questions about temperament and skills. This stranger had walked in and made his selection like he was choosing a horse he already knew. "How much?" Sterling asked, his voice steady and calm. Monroe's eyes narrowed. Something about this felt wrong. The man's clothes were travel-worn but well-made. His boots were expensive leather, barely scuffed. And those coins he'd produced weren't the rough silver pieces most drifters carried. They were minted fresh, the kind that came from banks in big cities. 300, Monroe said, testing. It was 3 times the usual price. Sterling didn't haggle. He counted out the coins without hesitation, stacking them in neat piles on Monroe's makeshift desk. The metallic clinks echoed in the sudden silence. Several men in the crowd exchanged glances. Nobody had that kind of money unless they were military. Government? Or worse. Boone Carter, Monroe's enforcer, stepped forward. His hand rested on the grip of his Colt. "Boss, maybe we should ask this gentleman some questions first. Like what brings him to our little settlement and why he's carrying so much silver." Sterling finished counting and looked up. When he smiled, it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm just a man looking for a wife. Isn't that what you're selling here?" The Comanche woman watched this exchange with sharp intelligence. Her wrists were raw from the iron restraints, but she held herself with dignity that the shackles couldn't diminish. When Sterling's gaze met hers again, she tilted her head slightly. The gesture was almost imperceptible, but it spoke volumes. Monroe pocketed the coins, but his expression remained suspicious. "The transaction is final once you take her. No returns, no complaints, and if she kills you in your sleep, that's your problem, not mine." Sterling nodded. "I understand the terms." He walked toward Ayanna, pulling a small key from his vest pocket. The crowd murmured in surprise. Monroe had the only key to those restraints. At least that's what everyone believed. But as Sterling reached for the shackles, Ayanna did something no one expected. She spoke, her voice clear and strong despite weeks of silence. "You're too late. They already know you're here." Sterling's hand froze over the shackles. Ayanna's words cut through the afternoon air like a blade. And suddenly, every man in the settlement was reaching for his weapon. But it wasn't the Comanche woman they were worried about anymore. It was the stranger who somehow had a key that shouldn't exist. Monroe's face went pale. "How does she know English? She hasn't spoken a word in 3 weeks." "Because she's been listening," Sterling said quietly, still focused on the restraints. "Learning who you are, learning what you've done, haven't you, Ayanna?" The use of her name sent a shock through the crowd. Monroe had never bothered to learn it. To him, she was just inventory. But this stranger knew exactly who she was, and that changed everything about why he was here. Boone Carter drew his revolver. "Boss, this ain't right. Nobody just wanders into our operation with the exact money and the right key. This man's law has to be." Sterling's laugh was dry and humorless. "Law in a place like this?" He gestured around the settlement with its ramshackle buildings and the platform where human beings were sold like cattle. "The law doesn't come to places like this, Carter. The law pretends places like this don't exist." The sound of his own name being spoken by a complete stranger made Boone's trigger finger twitch. "How do you know my name?" "Same way I know Monroe here has been running this operation for 2 years. Same way I know you've got 17 women locked in that storehouse behind the saloon. Same way I know about the mass grave on the hill where you bury the ones who fight too hard." The settlement went dead quiet. Even the wind seemed to stop blowing. Monroe's hand moved toward his gun, but something in Sterling's posture warned him off. The stranger stood relaxed, almost casual, but there was something coiled and dangerous about his stillness. "Who are you?" Monroe demanded. Sterling finally unlocked Ayanna's restraints. They fell to the platform with a metallic clatter that sounded like thunder in the silence. She rubbed her wrists, but never took her eyes off the crowd. "Tell them who you are," she said softly. "My name is Sterling Maddox," he said, and several men in the crowd took involuntary steps backward. "And I'm not here to buy a bride, I'm here to collect a debt." Monroe's face went from pale to ashen. The name meant something to him, something that made his hands shake as he reached for his weapon. "You're supposed to be dead." Reports of my death were greatly exaggerated. Sterling's coat fell open slightly, revealing not 1 but 2 Colts worn low on his hips. "But yours won't be." That's when the shooting started. Sterling's guns were in his hands before Monroe's finger found his trigger. The first shot shattered Monroe's wrist, sending his weapon spinning into the dirt. The second dropped Boone Carter before he could clear leather. Ayanna rolled off the platform and behind an overturned cart as chaos erupted around them. 3 more of Monroe's men charged from the saloon, but Sterling moved like he'd done this 1,000 times before. His shots were precise, calculated, not killing shots, but ones that removed threats without ending lives. Men dropped, clutching wounded arms and legs, their weapons scattered in the dust. "You always were too quick to reach for a gun, Monroe," Sterling said, reloading with practiced efficiency. "That's what got your brother killed." Monroe clutched his shattered wrist. His face twisted in pain and rage. "Jacob's death wasn't my fault. You know that your brother trusted you to watch his back during that job in Abilene. Instead, you ran when the shooting started, left him to die alone." Sterling's voice carried years of barely controlled fury. "But that's not why I'm here." Ayanna emerged from behind the cart, moving with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent her life avoiding danger. She grabbed a discarded rifle and checked its load with the expertise of a seasoned fighter. "The women in the storehouse," she said. "We need to get them out before more men arrive." Sterling nodded. "How many guards?" 2 at the door, 1 inside. Her English was perfect without a trace of accent. Another lie Monroe had told his customers. But there's something else you need to know about this place. Monroe laughed bitterly through his pain. Go ahead. Tell him. Tell him who really runs this operation. Tell him why killing me won't solve anything. Sterling's expression darkened. What's he talking about? Ayanna's jaw tightened. This isn't just Monroe's business. He's got partners, important partners, men with badges and government connections, men who make sure places like this stay hidden and profitable. The sound of approaching horses echoed from the settlement's main road. Too many horses, too organized to be coincidence. Sterling cursed under his breath. How many? Dozen riders, maybe more, Ayanna said, scanning the horizon. They've been expecting you. This whole thing was a trap. Monroe's laughter grew louder despite his pain. You think you're so smart, Maddox? Coming here to settle an old score, but you walked right into our hands. Those riders, they're not my men. They're federal marshals, and they've got warrants with your name on them. Sterling felt something cold settle in his stomach. Warrants for what? For the massacre at Willow Creek, for the death of Captain Morrison, for desertion in the face of the enemy. Monroe's eyes glittered with malicious satisfaction. That's right, Sterling. We know all about your war record, about what really happened to your unit. Ayanna's face went pale. Sterling, what is he talking about? But before Sterling could answer, the sound of rifle bolts being worked echoed from the rooftops around them. They were surrounded, and the truth about Sterling's past was about to become the least of their problems. The voice that called down from the rooftops was cold and official. Sterling Maddox, you're under arrest for war crimes against the United States Army. Surrender your weapons and submit to federal authority. Sterling didn't move. His eyes scanned the settlement, counting muzzles, calculating angles. 12 rifles pointed down at them from various rooftops and windows. Professional positions, military training. These weren't ordinary marshals. Captain Morrison sends his regards, the voice continued, though I suppose we should call him Colonel Morrison now. Your death at Willow Creek gave him quite the promotion. Ayanna's sharp intake of breath made Sterling turn toward her. You know Morrison? He was the one who ordered the raid on my village, she said quietly. 3 months ago said we were harboring Army deserters, burned everything, killed my father, my brothers, took the women and girls to sell them to places like this. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Morrison hadn't died at Willow Creek. He'd orchestrated the whole thing. Used Sterling's unit as scapegoats for his own war crimes, then built a profitable business selling native women to settlements like Monroe's. Morrison's alive, Sterling said, his voice barely above a whisper. Very much alive, Monroe sneered, and very interested in tying up loose ends. Like the only witness to what really happened at Willow Creek, Sterling's mind raced back to that terrible day. His unit had been ordered to attack a Comanche village suspected of harboring Confederate deserters. But when they arrived, they found only families, women, children, old men. Sterling had refused the order to fire. His men had followed his lead, standing down despite Morrison's screaming commands. That's when Morrison's other unit had opened fire. Not on the village, but on Sterling's men, caught between their commanding officer and their conscience. Most of Sterling's unit had died in the crossfire. Sterling himself had been left for dead, buried under the bodies of his friends. You survived because I pulled you from that pile of corpses, Ayanna said softly. My father found you bleeding in the grass. We nursed you back to health, but by the time you were strong enough to travel, Morrison had already reported you dead. Reported all of you as casualties of a heroic battle against insurgents. The federal voice called down again. You have 30 seconds to surrender. Maddox. After that, we start shooting to kill. Sterling looked at Ayanna, seeing her clearly for the first time. The daughter of the chief who had saved his life, the woman whose village Morrison had destroyed to cover his tracks. The last witness to the truth about Willow Creek besides Sterling himself. There's one thing Morrison doesn't know, Sterling said, checking his ammunition. What's that? Ayanna asked. I didn't come here alone. Sterling smiled grimly and raised his voice toward the rooftops. Did you hear that, boys? They think I'm the only survivor of Willow Creek. That's when the ghosts of his unit opened fire from the settlement's perimeter. The crack of rifle fire erupted from 3 directions simultaneously. The federal marshals on the rooftops suddenly found themselves caught in crossfire from men they couldn't see, men who knew their positions before they'd even taken them. Sterling's surviving unit members had been watching this settlement for days, waiting for exactly this moment. Sergeant Tommy Whitmore's voice carried across the settlement from behind the water tower. Looks like the Army taught us something useful after all, Captain, Private Hayes called out from near the stables. These boys sure aren't as good as they think they are. Sterling grabbed Ayanna's hand and pulled her toward the storehouse, while chaos erupted around them. Stay low. My men will keep them busy, but we need to get those women out before Morrison arrives. How do you know he's coming? Ayanna asked, ducking as a bullet winded overhead. Because he can't afford to let me live. I'm the only one who can testify about what really happened at Willow Creek, about how he executed his own men to cover up his crimes. They reached the storehouse just as Boone Carter, wounded but still dangerous, stumbled around the corner with a shotgun. Sterling's draw was faster, but Ayanna was quicker. Her rifle butt caught Carter in the temple, dropping him like a stone. Nice work, Sterling said, kicking Carter's weapon away. I've had practice. Ayanna's expression was grim. Monroe's men killed my youngest brother when he tried to protect our women. I've been planning this revenge for months. Sterling shot the lock off the storehouse door. Inside, 17 women huddled in the darkness, most of them young, all of them, terrified. They spoke different languages, came from different tribes, but they all shared the same haunted look of people who'd lost everything. We're here to help, Ayanna said in her native tongue, then repeated it in Spanish and broken English. But we need to move fast. Sterling handed out weapons from a cache his men had hidden nearby. Can they fight? They're survivors, Ayanna replied. They'll do what they have to do. The sound of approaching horses grew louder, not just the dozen riders from before, but more, many more. Through the settlement's main entrance, a column of blue uniforms appeared. Army regulars led by a man Sterling recognized even at a distance. Colonel Morrison sat his horse like he owned the world. His uniform was immaculate, his bearing confident. The medals on his chest caught the afternoon sun, each one representing a lie, a cover-up, a life destroyed in service of his ambition. Sterling Maddox. Morrison's voice carried clearly across the settlement. It's time we finished what we started at Willow Creek. Sterling stepped into the open, his hands resting on his gun butts. Behind him, Ayanna and the freed women took positions in the storehouse windows around the settlement. His men waited in the shadows. I couldn't agree more, Sterling called back. But this time, the whole world's going to know the truth about what you did. Morrison's smile was cold as winter. The truth? The truth is that you're a deserter and a traitor, and dead men don't tell tales. Morrison dismounted slowly, his hand resting on his saber hilt. You know, Sterling, I always wondered if you were truly dead. That's why I had to eliminate any witnesses, including that inconvenient Comanche village that sheltered you. You murdered innocent families to cover your tracks, Sterling said, his voice carrying across the settlement. Women, children, elders who had nothing to do with your war crimes. War crimes? Morrison laughed. I was following orders. Orders to pacify hostile tribes and recover stolen Army property. If some deserters got caught in the crossfire, that's the price of justice. Ayanna stepped out beside Sterling, her rifle trained on Morrison. There were no stolen weapons in our village, no deserters. You killed my family because they saved this man's life. And you couldn't let that act of mercy expose your lies. Morrison's confidence wavered slightly when he saw her. You should have died with the rest of them. Tell him about the gold, Morrison, Sterling called out. Tell him about the real reason you ordered the attack on Willow Creek. The colonel's face went pale. I don't know what you're talking about. The Confederate gold shipment you intercepted. The one that was supposed to reach Richmond, but mysteriously disappeared. My unit stumbled onto your little operation, didn't we? That's why you had to eliminate us. Morrison's hand moved to his revolver. You can't prove anything. Actually, I can. Ayanna reached into her shirt and pulled out a leather pouch. When my father rescued you from that battlefield, you were carrying this document signed by Morrison detailing his arrangement with Confederate agents. Bills of sale for stolen weapons, payment records for gold that never reached its destination. Sterling smiled grimly. I gave those papers to Chief Running Bear for safekeeping. Asked him to hold them until I could figure out what to do with them. Took me 3 years to decide. Morrison drew his weapon, but Sterling was ready. The two shots came so close together they sounded like one. Morrison's bullet went wide, sparked off a hitching post. Sterling's found its mark, shattering Morrison's gun hand and dropping the revolver into the dirt. Stand down, Sterling ordered. The Army regulars. Your commanding officer is under arrest for war crimes, theft of government property, and murder. Most of the soldiers looked confused, uncertain. They'd been told they were hunting a dangerous deserter, not arresting their own colonel. But a few of the older sergeants had heard rumors about Morrison's methods, about operations that went too far, bodies that piled up unnecessarily. Sergeant First Class Reynolds stepped forward. What proof do you have, Maddox? Sterling nodded, to Ayanna, who held up the documents. Everything you need is right here. Names, dates, amounts. Morrison's been selling government weapons to the highest bidder and pocketing the profits. When my unit discovered his operation, he had us executed and reported us as casualties of an Indian attack. Morrison clutched his bleeding hand, his face twisted with rage and desperation. You think anyone will believe the word of a deserter and a savage over a decorated Army officer? They'll believe the evidence, Reynolds said, taking the documents from Ayanna. His face grew darker with each page he read. Jesus Christ, Colonel. How long has this been going on? But Morrison wasn't finished. With his good hand, he pulled a derringer from his boot. A last desperate gambit. His target wasn't Sterling. It was Ayanna. Sterling's third shot took Morrison in the chest before the derringer cleared his boot. The colonel toppled backward into the dust, his weapon unfired, his eyes wide with shock, and the bitter knowledge that his crimes had finally caught up with him. Blood spread across his pristine uniform, staining the medals that represented a career built on lies and murder. Ayanna knelt beside Morrison as his breathing grew shallow. My father would have shown you mercy, she said quietly. He would have said that even evil men deserve forgiveness in their final moments. But I am not my father. Morrison tried to speak, but only blood came from his lips. His eyes found Sterling's face one last time, filled with hate and regret in equal measure. Then the light went out of them, and Colonel Morrison's reign of terror came to an end. Sergeant Reynolds holstered his weapon and turned to address his men. Stand down, all of you. According to these documents, we've been following the orders of a criminal. Maddox and his people are under military protection until we can sort this mess out. Sterling looked around the settlement at the aftermath of the battle. Monroe sat propped against a fence post, his shattered wrist bound with strips torn from his own shirt. Several of his men lay wounded but alive, their weapons scattered in the dust. The Federal marshals who had survived the crossfire were being disarmed by Sterling's unit. Tommy Whitmore emerged from behind the water tower, his rifle slung casually over his shoulder. Well, Captain, I'd say we finally got justice for the boys. Justice for everyone? Sterling replied, watching as the freed women helped each other out of the storehouse. They moved with the careful grace of people who had survived hell and lived to see the dawn. Some clutched weapons, others supported injured companions, but all of them shared the same expression of cautious hope. Ayanna organized the women with quiet efficiency, speaking to each group in their native languages. "Most of them have families to return to," she told Sterling. "The army will provide escort and supplies for the journey home." "And what about you?" Sterling asked. Ayanna looked at the documents still clutched in Sergeant Reynolds's hands. Then at Morrison's body, then at the settlement that had been built on suffering and greed. "My village is gone. My family is dead. But these women need someone to speak for them when the trials begin. Someone who understands what they've endured." Sterling nodded. "The government will want testimonies, evidence. It's going to be a long process. Then it's good that I'm not going anywhere." Ayanna's smile was small but genuine. "Besides, someone needs to make sure you don't get yourself killed before you can testify against Morrison's other associates. This operation was bigger than just one settlement." Monroe laughed bitterly from his position against the fence. "You think killing Morrison solves anything? He had partners in Washington, generals who looked the other way, politicians who took their cut. You've won one battle, but the war is far from over." Sterling exchanged a look with Ayanna. They both knew Monroe was right. Morrison's death was just the beginning. 6 months later, Sterling stood outside the federal courthouse in Denver, watching as Monroe was led away in shackles. The trial had been swift and decisive, faced with overwhelming evidence and testimony from 17 rescued women. The jury had needed less than an hour to reach their verdict. Monroe would spend the rest of his life in military prison along with the 6 other officers who had been part of Morrison's network. Ayanna emerged from the courthouse steps, carrying a leather satchel filled with documents. Her testimony had been the most damaging of all, delivered in 3 languages with the precision of someone who had memorized every detail of her suffering. The judge had called her the most credible witness he'd encountered in 30 years on the bench. "The last of the women reached their families yesterday," she told Sterling. "Maria's tribe welcomed her back with a ceremony. The Mexican girls were reunited with their parents in Santa Fe. Even the ones who had no families found new homes with people who understand their trauma." Sterling nodded, watching the prison wagon disappear around the corner and the politicians who were taking bribes from Morrison. 3 senators resigned in disgrace. The Secretary of War is under investigation, and the Army has established a new department to investigate crimes against native populations. Ayanna's smile was satisfied. "Your friend, Sergeant Reynolds, is heading it up." They walked together toward the hotel where Sterling's surviving unit members were waiting. Tommy Whitmore had been promoted to lieutenant and given command of a new company dedicated to protecting tribal lands. Private Hayes had accepted a position training Army investigators in frontier survival techniques. All of them had been officially pardoned and given back pay for the 3 years they'd been listed as dead. "So, what happens now?" Ayanna asked. As they reached the hotel's front steps, Sterling pulled out a letter he'd been carrying for weeks. "The governor of New Mexico Territory has offered me a position as territorial marshal. Seems they need someone with experience in rooting out corruption in remote settlements. And you're considering it?" "Only if I can choose my own deputy." Sterling handed her the letter. "The pay is good, the work is important, and the territory is large enough that we'd never run out of wrongs to right." Ayanna read the letter carefully, her expression thoughtful. A territorial marshal and his deputy riding. The frontier together, bringing justice to places the law has forgotten. She folded the letter and handed it back. "It sounds like something out of a dime novel. The best stories usually do." Sterling smiled, but this one would be real and it would make a difference. Ayanna looked back at the courthouse where Monroe's trial had just concluded. Then, at the letter in Sterling's hands. than at the wide expanse of territory that stretched beyond Denver's borders. Somewhere out there, other corrupt officials were exploiting vulnerable people. Other women were being sold like cattle. Other communities were suffering in silence. "When do we start?" she asked. Sterling's grin was, "Answer enough." Together they walked into the hotel to inform the others of their decision. Behind them, the courthouse bells chimed the hour, marking not just the end of Monroe's trial, but the beginning of a new chapter in the fight for justice on the American frontier. The war Morrison had started was over. The work Sterling and Ayanna would do together was just beginning. And for the first time since Willow Creek, Sterling Maddox felt like he was exactly where he belonged. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable Western tale where courage and justice collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to